This time we go back to the days of the Cold War once again to look at 5 more Eastern Bloc motorcycles. Well, after our previous video on Eastern European bikes, we've had a lot of suggestions about other bikes we could mention. I have to say some of which I have never heard of before in my life. So a little bit of research, and these are 5 more bikes from Eastern Europe. A Junak M10. If, like me, you've gone through life having no idea that they ever produced motorcycles in Poland, then almost certainly you would not have heard of the Junak. The bikes were actually produced between the end of the Second World War and 1989. They came in 3 variants, the M07, M10 and B20. Although essentially they're all very similar machines, there's just slight variation between each model. Between 56 and 65 it said that around 91,000 machines were actually built. The name Junak incidentally means brave young man in Polish. And I have to say this is a very pretty little bike, and it's really so that I've never heard of these before. And it is something that I think most people would be very proud to have in their garage if they're kind of into classic bikes. The machines, I suppose, were not unlike those classically built in Britain at the time. They were single-cylinder overhead valve 4-stroke, using a long-stroke motor to make up 349 cc's. Compression ratio was of course fairly low at 7:1, max power was around 19 horsepower at 6,000 rpm, and there was dry sump lubrication. All of which were fairly typical specifications for a 350 to 500 single made in Britain or pretty much anywhere else in Europe during that period. The machine has a claim top speed of 125 km an hour, that's around 75 miles an hour, so again very comparable to say a Velocette built in Britain at the same period. So you might wonder why the bike wasn't a massive success and why we've not all heard of Junak. Simply put, in their native Poland, these bikes were very expensive, and in the fairly austere days of the 1950s, this limited sales somewhat. Another problem that hampered its sales internationally that was due to the turmoil in the company throughout the production life of the bike. Build quality was quite variable, sometimes good, sometimes not so good, particularly when they relied on locally sourced components. The collapse of the communist system in Poland in 1989 brought about an end of the Junak production. Although the name is still used today, although it's actually attached to Chinese machines imported locally into Poland. Fortunately, a number of these machines do survive, and they are regarded as highly collectible classics within their native land. Unfortunately, they're not very well known outside. The Izh Planeta 350. The Russian company Izh manufactured both automobiles and motorcycles. The company's best known product is their Lada automobiles, but Izh did produce motorcycles from 1928, beginning with a 1200cc across the frame V-twin with shaft drive. Post-war production was dominated by the use of 2-stroke engines, mostly based on DKWs, and in the 70s and 80s these machines would be sold in Britain under the Cossack and Naval brands, and the Planeta's name would also be changed to Jupiter. The engine produced a claimed 32 horsepower, enough to push the machine along at around 130 km an hour. The Planeta was given modernised styling to help it compete with the European and more importantly Japanese competitors, but in fact in the West few were actually sold. But the Planeta was relatively modern by the standards of the time. It was the first Izh machine to run automatic oiling, and performance was pretty good considering its DKW roots. The Planeta would remain in production until 1985 and is today quite a collectible Russian classic. Csepel Motorcycles. The Manfred Weiss steelworks were founded in the town of Csepel in Hungary in 1897 and would soon become the second largest industrial company in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The company would grow very rapidly from 1911 when the Austro-Hungarian Empire significantly expanded its military budget. However, in 1944, Germany invaded Hungary, and the Jewish Weiss family were forced to flee, allowing the Nazi Party to take control of the factory. Production of bicycles had begun at the factory in 1928, and between 1931 and 1935 they had briefly built motorcycles too. But post-war, under communist control, the factory began production of motorcycles, with full production starting in 1951 and ending in 1975. Csepel's post-war production was of two-stroke machines ranging between 100cc and 250cc. The Csepel factory's motorcycles were sold under a variety of names, including Danuvia, Tundi, Pani and Pannonia, and in the United States they were sold under the white name. But the big problem was that although these machines were fairly competent when first introduced, very little development was ever completed, and the machines soon fell behind in terms of technology. As a result, the machines were seen as antiquated relics by the 1970s. In October 1975, all production of motorcycles would cease. Production of bicycles would continue until 1993, when that too would be brought to an end. The Simson S51. Simson was a manufacturing company based in Germany. They produced firearms, automobiles, bicycles and motorcycles. The Jewish Simson family were forced to flee Germany during the 1930s. The factory was then taken over by the Third Reich, and it was at this point that the first motorcycle appeared, a 98cc two-stroke. Post-war, under communist control, the factory produced a range of 250cc overhead valve four-stroke machines. But after producing some 209,000 of these machines, the company was forced to switch to moped production. In 1955, the company introduced the SR1. This was a 48cc moped, producing around 1.5 horsepower. This machine was then developed into various forms throughout the 50s and 60s, including fairly conventional style mopeds, off-roaders, and of course scooters. In 1975, they introduced the S50. This had a revised shorter stroke engine, which produced 3.6 horsepower. This version was built until 1980, when it was succeeded by the S51 and its S70 stablemate. Changes with the S51 included that longer stroke motor, which produced around 3.7 horsepower. The S70, which arrived in 83, produced around 5.6 horsepower. These models would continue virtually unchanged until 1990, when the change of the political climate would see the end of the S51. But the Simson has gained cult status since it was deleted, and remains a popular classic moped long after the original company faded from view in 2003. Ural motorcycles. In 1940, the Soviet Union acquired design and production rights for the BMW R71 motorcycles and sidecars. The first M72, as it was called, was finished in 1941. Original factories were located in Moscow, Leningrad, now of course St. Petersburg, and Kharkiv. Due to the approaching Nazis, the Moscow facilities were moved into Irbit, and the Leningrad and Kharkiv factories to Kharkiv, now Nizhny Novgorod. After the war, the factory was expanded greatly, and by 1950, the 30,000th machine had actually been completed. Initially, all production was intended for military use, but by the late 50s, it had been decided to turn the Irbit factory production over to civilian use. Export of the machine to Soviet satellite states began in 1953, but between 1973 and 1979, the machine was actually exported into Great Britain, under the Cossack name by the importer Satra. In 1957, all the M72 production lines were sold to the People's Republic of China. In its place came an all-new 650 overhead valve motor, and this would form the basis of all the Urals sold to this point. To date, just over 3.2 million Urals have been completed. The latest model of the Ural is of course a boxer twin. It's 749cc with square dimensions of 78 by 78. It kicks out 41 horsepower at 5,500 RPM, a little bit more than the 650, which was somewhere in the mid-30s. Most of these machines are fitted with a sidecar, although they are available as solos. All production was moved to Kazakhstan in 2022 as a result of Russia's invasion of the Ukraine. What interesting collections of motorcycles would you like to see made into a video? Please let us know below. I do hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.